So let me officially just kick off here. It's Carol Stewart. I'm CEO of AURP, the Association of University Research Parks, and I want to welcome everyone to the Benchmarking Your Research Park and Identifying Cluster Strengths for Innovation Attraction Success webinar with our knowledge partners from ROI. That's Research on Investment. I want to say welcome to our new partners. This is I love seeing our partners jazzed about being affiliated with AURP, and I'm going to introduce our special guest for today, Stephen Jast. He's the president and founder of ROI. Steve is a seasoned executive who has been working in all facets of economic development for 25 years. You never know that by looking at him. Who started his career in site selection and business location analysis, jurisdictional marketing, and industrial clustering. ROI was a spin-out company that launched in 2003, and Steve has served as president from day one. Joining Steve today is Dr. Nadine Jeserich, vice president of analytics, and leads the business intelligence team at ROI. Nadine is recognized as a leading authority on cluster and value chain analysis, identifying emerging industries and occupations, innovation metrics, competitiveness benchmarking, and workforce development. Such a pleasure to have both of them with us today to discuss our topic in the context specifically for research parks and innovation districts. I hope they will augment these very brief bio introductions to enforce the caliber of the industry experts that they are. Now, before I hand it off to Steve, I think he's gonna kick us off and get us started. Let me just cover a few housekeeping items. First of all, there is a substantial amount of awesome content to cover in the next 60 minutes. So we're going to hold our questions until the end of the presentation. And please use the chat feature located on the right-hand side of your screen. That's the little bubble there. Use that feature to send your questions to Steve, Nadine, or myself. I'm going to be facilitating the questions, so you can either do it privately or you can send the questions out to everyone. I also had many emails asking if AURP will post the webinar at a later date because members had conflicts on their calendars. So ROI has graciously allowed us to post the webinar and slide deck for everyone to reference and review. And finally, the only person who will have their mic unmuted is the speaker once we begin. And then the three of us will just have our mics opened up when it comes time to Q&A. So I think that covers it right now. Steve, if I've missed anything, over to you.
Thanks so much, Carol. Thanks. That's a great introduction. And Nadine and I are just thrilled to be here. Couldn't be happier and more proud of our relationship with the AURP and to try and provide some interesting content to your membership as it relates to investment attraction and the work that we've done in investment attraction over the course of the past 15 years. So as you mentioned, I started my career about 25 years ago as a site selection consultant. Did that for about 12 years, and then we started ROI, due primarily to the fact that a lot of our economic development friends were asking us if we knew of companies that were in expansion mode. And so we created ROI as a vehicle to try and share business intelligence that we're able to generate as it specifically related to companies that were growing. I guess one of the major turning points in our business was about 3 years ago when we started to develop an AI-powered data platform called Gazelle. What this does is it provides indexing of companies based on some trained algorithms as it relates to their likelihood to expand. And we'll talk maybe a little bit more about that later on. I have with me Dr. Nadine Jeserich. Nadine joined our team, I guess, a little over 2 years ago now. Nadine heads up our consulting practice, which focuses primarily on benchmark assessment. Benchmark assessment tries to, or essentially does, help our economic development clients better understand the relative strengths and weaknesses against comparator locations. She also does all kinds of work relating to workforce assessment, occupation assessment. She also does a lot of work in industrial clustering. And Nadine has been a great resource to us as we worked with many clients in the consulting field across North America over the course of the 2 years that she's been with us. So a bit on ROI before we jump into our subject matter, just to give you a bit of an idea of who we are. So we have 60 people. We're a Canadian company. Our headquarters are located in Montreal. We have offices across the US, 6 offices in Chicago, New York, Washington, San Diego, and Denver. We have a toehold, a footprint, if you will, in Europe, in Toulouse, France, and in Herne, Germany. The trajectory of our work is truly international, and our staff reflects that. We speak over 25 languages here in the office, and that's very useful when it comes down to some of the gathering of business intelligence that we do. And the business intelligence gathering that we do relates to trying to identify companies that are growing. And as you can see by our big logo to the right, we're celebrating our 15th anniversary this year, and we're super proud about that. So what are our key services? So it is lead generation. So we've worked with about 300 economic development organizations from around the world. We're pretty much industry agnostic. We work across pretty much all industries, but primarily the ones that we do work in are related to advanced manufacturing, biotech, high-tech industries. We also do some work related to financial services, business services. As I talked a little bit earlier, Nadine heads up our market intelligence and targeting strategies division. We do quite a bit of work in business expansion and retention and helping our clients understand the importance of BR&E and helping understand which companies to prioritize in their BR&E efforts. We do a lot of work as it relates to market representation, economic development training, and trade shows and events. Okay, so what is the ROI philosophy? What drives the work that we do in investment attraction? Over the course of the past 15 years that we've been in business, I would probably suggest to you that the one main difference, the driving trend in our business is in data and the availability and proliferation of data. And when I look back at my career, when we first started ROI, when we would call an economic development organization for information about their particular jurisdiction, we'd get a big brown manila envelope with a bunch of brochures in it. And those brochures were usually 2 years old. So we'd have to have conversations with the head of those economic development organizations and get more updated information. Today, however, the amount of data and the timeliness of that data is just amazing. So when we take a look at how to best position ourselves for investment attraction, I always tell my clients it's extremely important to, understand how to use data both from a marketing perspective and from a positioning perspective. When we talk about marketing, we talk about social, digital, traditional marketing, and more specifically, understanding the analytics and the conversion rates from what we call a prospect to a lead, to a qualified lead, and to a company that could ultimately come to our jurisdiction. It's incredibly important to try and understand the kinds of companies that are converting best, why they're converting best, and which marketing techniques are we using that are promoting the best kinds of conversion. We then talk about positioning, which are some of the subject matter to the right of the chart, to the right of the big blue data. When I talk about positioning, I'm trying to convey a notion that our economic development clients have to have a sense of who they are. What is their relative strength and weakness versus comparator locations? What is your unique selling proposition, your value proposition? If we cannot talk to potential companies that want to come to our jurisdiction, or in our case, to our science park, our research park, and if we can't clearly talk to them about what the value proposition is of our park, it's going to be hard for them to understand why they should come there and set up shop there. We also need to have a really strong understanding of our workforce. We need to have a strong understanding of industry trends. Where are the companies that we want to attract located? Where are their cluster growth hotspots where we should spend the majority of our marketing dollars? Once we understand how to use analytics from a marketing perspective, and once we understand who we are from a positioning perspective, we can then deploy a truly data-supported strategy. And when we deploy a truly data-supported strategy, we then enhance our likelihood for success in driving investment, driving job creation to our jurisdiction and to our science and research parks. Okay, so with that being said, I'm now going to hand over the floor to Nadine. So Nadine, here we go. So Nadine, the floor is now yours.
Okay, thank you, Steve. And thank you again for AURP for giving us this opportunity today and for everybody joining us. So the idea of this webinar was really to start out with probably a survey that all the AURP members are familiar with from Battelle from 2012 that looked at the most important drivers for a successful university research park. And that was, it has to be a good fit between the tenants and the universities, and that basically means identifying the most suitable industries and companies. And that's kind of is our overall theme of today. I'm going to talk a bit about the process of industry targeting and developing your value proposition. And Steve is then going to follow up on how to actually put some of these things into practice. A typical industry targeting process goes usually through at least 6 main phases. You try to assess what industries and clusters you already have in your region and in your parks. You try to identify the best growth and emerging opportunities. You look at some supply chain gaps that you might be able to attack. You then usually move on to a SWOT analysis about your strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities and threats to your region to figure out which of these opportunities would be most suitable for your region and which ones you should be prioritizing. Then you would need to figure out how to sell yourself, as Steve mentioned. So you have to figure out who your competitors are, benchmark your region, and try to refine your unique selling proposition as much as possible, and then go out and find the regions and companies to target. Now, research parks are a little bit unique. A typical analysis would basically start with kind of a data dump on industries and workforce availability in the region. But with university and innovation districts, it's really much more about their particular assets and outcomes that take priority. And it's certainly also less straightforward than running numbers on industries in an area, because the data is less centralized, less standardized, and it's also much more often about networks and relationships. Something that some people who have done kind of looked in industries analysis and cluster reports might be familiar with this kind of bubble chart as kind of one of these typical traditional cluster analysis tools, where you basically try to figure out, okay, what industries are already very specialized in terms of the job share in the region, the location quotient, where have we been growing the most jobs, relatively speaking, and you try to figure out which ones are your emerging clusters, but in terms of very research-oriented areas and things like the research parks, you're also looking at emerging technologies that might help mature and transforming clusters to take advantage of the local assets and infrastructures. One thing to keep in mind with regards to clusters, some of these, the bubble chart you saw previously, you usually look at some standard definition of clusters. Usually people use the Harvard definition of industry clusters. The problem is research parks are really at the forefront of technological advances. So maybe new technologies are applied to traditional industries that create a very unique set of assets. Maybe companies are collaborating on a very specific research question, and that also makes it a very niche and highly unique emerging sector in your particular park. Now, there's certainly a usefulness of standardizing cluster definitions, particularly if we want to benchmark or assess trends and policy effectiveness. But in the end, I think they're always very local phenomenon. And they might not fit with existing NAICS codes, or they could also represent very unusual combinations of industries. So you might, for example, have a very advanced construction sector that gets into smart buildings and connected construction sites that would be a combination of IT and construction that no current cluster definition would put together. Another example, kind of a real world example, if you, for example, look at the biopharmaceuticals in Boston, very big sector and has a significant share of legal and financial services in the region that are specifically dedicated to serving the needs of those biopharma companies. Now, might make sense to include these numbers if you're profiling the Boston biopharmaceutical cluster, but if you're trying to do a national comparison of trends in biopharma clusters, you should only really look at industries that are included across all regions systematically linked with biopharmaceuticals. So in terms of your efforts to establish your target industries, your value proposition, it's really so much more about yourself in the beginning and understanding what you have. And that gets us also to another very important aspect, to assess what you have to work with and build upon, stakeholder involvement becomes much more important than in a typical target industry analysis, because the potential interested companies are looking for close ties to existing tenants and university assets. There could be, for example, several departments that collaborate or interact with the same company. That could be a good target. You could profit from being located closer to the university research. And that's something you can't really find out with data these days. Another thing to take into account for very research and technology driven targeting is to look at the industry lifecycle. So when you're looking at the kind of industries that are accelerating and that might have very strong R&D intensities, those tend to be the kind of industries in the certain niche areas that might be looking for university and research support and be in a very kind of innovative environment. You also, look at some of those that are kind of coming out of a slump and has been reinventing themselves. But even here, they're always just kind of starting points. Motor vehicles and parts, generally traditional ones, are probably seen more on a decline at the moment. But on the other hand, if you look at parts and electronics for autonomous vehicles, that is really on the upswing and the rise at the moment. So you kind of have to really dig into it in terms of individual technologies that you have access to through the university and through the research. Another interesting source is also to look at venture capital funding to refine your industry priorities and industry targets. Venture capital is usually a good indication which industries have a high concentration of startups that might be a focus of your park, of accelerating growth companies, certainly. And it gets to some of those emerging technologies as well that could be linked to your research assets. VC funding can also be helpful in pinpointing the most suitable companies for targeting. So seed stage companies from other regions that might not have an established research park or very supportive business environment might look for a new home to move to for the next growth phase. At the same time, you might have the kind of medium stage companies that move kind of from the early to the late stage, that in expansion mode, they're basically receiving expansion capital, that are thinking about setting up new facilities, or they might be interested in outsourcing their R&D facilities to be in a more collaborative environment. And those could also be good targets in terms of the type of companies that you could go after. Besides the overall industries, another thing to take into consideration is your supply chain. Now, the Patel survey some years ago found that on average, over 40% of businesses leaving the park will actually stay within the region. So the larger ecosystem and the supply chain they can plug into is important as well. So to be able to provide them with the kind of ecosystem keeps them there can strengthen the overall network and cluster and the economic impact of your district or university park. Because otherwise, and that same goes for outside the park, what companies need, that they cannot access within your region is just money left on the table that is leaving the regional economy. So the role of the research park can certainly be in the attraction efforts to both supplement its current park's tenants' needs as well as the wider regional cluster needs. You can use some of the existing data tools. If you're wondering kind of how you would go about identifying supply chain gaps, you can certainly look at input-output models that tell you what the key suppliers are for your typical NAICS code, if you're lucky enough to have a specific NAICS code, and who's buying typically those products. You can also look at what kind of job concentrations are over or underrepresented to get an idea of what kind of companies with what kind of skill set could be supplementing your cluster. But again, research parks are very unique and have very specific emerging innovation and technology needs. So the most accurate assessment of their supply chain will most likely come from survey work. And to just another thing to take into account if you're looking at targeting specific companies, you need to hone in on your target audience, just like any other marketing strategy. So figuring out how to position yourself competitively. Your current infrastructure and support makes it certainly more suitable for some companies than others. So you might have an incubator already set up and want to supplement it with more kind of startup companies and spin-offs. You might be oriented towards kind of the heavy R&D centers with your resources. You might want to focus on a very particular research area because there's just an unusual strength of international caliber in your area. And each of them imply a different approach in terms of how you target these kind of companies and what they're looking for. One example that's chosen that's still very generalized is what a typical R&D center is looking for in site selection. So everybody always highlights, of course, the availability of the right kind of labor, but R&D centers also expect a much more collaborative and entrepreneurial environment than, for example, a manufacturer or just an IT company. The ability to find and attract top research from all over the world. So for them, it's the entrepreneurial environment, and it's also some of the soft factors in the quality of life that might outweigh some of the hard dollar site selection factors that something like a manufacturing company would probably prioritize. So again, pitching your unique assets becomes crucial when you go after these unique type of companies and business activities. So where do you start to determine how competitive your region is for your targets and how you're going to pitch yourself? You can certainly start looking at what has been successful in your region in terms of business attraction, including international business attraction in your wider area or even your state, to see what has been, that can be a signal of what kind of companies have found your region and state attractive. Stakeholder involvement, again, is always a good place to start. What regions have they been, what countries have they been collaborating with, and what do they see as your key selling points? And a typical starting point would be to conduct a SWOT analysis, to really look at, again, with stakeholder involvement, to understand your product before you can market it, what your strengths and opportunities are, but also the weaknesses and threats. Yes, you're trying to create a marketing plan and your selling proposition, but when you talk to a company, you also want to be able to preempt any potential criticisms or concerns about your area. So you need to kind of be aware of your weaknesses and know how to address them as well. So what it helps you with is really to prioritize and refine your industry target list. So when you talk to university stakeholders, both on the research and education side, of course, the private sector, industry leaders, especially if there's a mix of foreign and domestic companies, that is very important. Newcomers to the region versus already established local companies will give you very good insights into how they see and perceive the environment. It is obviously a lot about perception. Again, that's why it helps to talk to people and not just look at data. And of course, your public sector officials to see how they're linking and how they're working with the industry and the university. And what you're really trying to do is to put yourselves in the shoes of the investor and ask, what are they looking for? Why, what could they see as attractive in this location? And what questions would they be asking? And to really have kind of a battle plan and a cheat sheet when they call that, exactly how to answer the most common and most likely questions they will pose. And as I mentioned before, you certainly want to be aware of your strengths and weaknesses and be able to talk to any potential lack of whether it's infrastructure or workforce and how you're planning to help them kind of get around that. If they're aware of it, you obviously don't want to mention something if it's not necessary. Once you kind of have a sense of what your local stakeholders perceive as your strengths and weaknesses, you do want to go out and try to measure yourself against your competition. You want to understand why your location was not included on an investor's shortlist. That's certainly an exercise that anybody who has competed for the Amazon headquarters has undergone in the last year. And it was a very valuable lesson for a lot of these places to understand what kind of information they haven't even thought about and which ones they have not collected and how they're selling themselves. So to assess your competing locations as well as your own will make you able to create a kind of priority list of what you can mention to potential investors, and also say, well, if they're saying, oh, well, we're considering the North Carolina Research Park, and you can say, well, we might have something that they don't have, and you can immediately speak to that. So how do you create an internationally attractive value proposition for research park, and including for even smaller research parks? Some of the most typical, more innovation and research-oriented site selection factors are certainly the entrepreneurial environment, how dynamic is the university in terms of their spin-offs and licenses. You certainly want to have a handle on your data, or even especially if it's not complete, that you usually prepare, if you're part of it, for the licensing survey for the Association of University Technology Managers, the ATM survey. That's always a good starting point to be able to compare yourself against other universities. You certainly also want to see if you have any information about existing foreign direct investment flows and patent activity. You want to dig a little bit into some of the information on funding. That's always, depending on the type of company, very important. Venture capital funding and a lot of the small business funding, whether it's the SBIC or the technology funding from the SBA, like the STTR. You want to be able to, of course, speak also to the human capital, the amount of graduate students you produce, and the overall regional workforce, and especially the trends in those developments and any kind of unique programs that you have, depending on the industry and the type of company and what they're looking for. And especially, I think, for innovation districts and research parks, the quality of life, the kind of live, work, and play environment has become much more important. It has kind of taken much more of a forefront. Again, if you look at the criteria that Amazon, even though they were looking really for a whole city to take over, but they certainly highlighted how important it was to have amenities and the infrastructure and the kind of environment that will attract the people they need, because that will be important, especially since you're usually looking for an almost international workforce in most cases. So as an example, we kind of looked at some of the top commercialization universities. The Milken Institute put those together last year. So they based them on R&D spending, and startups initiate a lot of the ATM data, the licenses, the licensing income, patents that have been granted, and rank the universities across the US. Now, you see, of course, a lot of historic top schools, but some of those have also risen as research and commercialization hotspots over the last, say, decade, especially the University of Utah. And I think it's partially the overall state has really been making a lot of headwind on the technology side in the last 10 years, more so than really any other state or region. So how would a place like the Utah BIONIC Valley, the research park of the University of Utah, how would they stand out and highlight their assets in a very kind of short one-page overview, so to say? Well, they probably would highlight that they're one of the top 20 metros in the nation for venture capital funding, that they're third in the nation for the ability to attract and retain tech talent. Utah is also a very highly ranked state for SBIC funding, so the Small Business Investment Company Program, where private investors partner with the SBA to fund small companies. So they have a lot of funding available, which is certainly important for the early stages and small and medium-sized enterprises. And Salt Lake City also ranked 10th in the best places to live in one of the most recent years. So they certainly have a very strong value proposition. And being able to summarize, not everybody can be the top 10 in something. So some places will certainly have a harder time finding the right assets, but you already have a university there. So you're way ahead of other regions that have been doing successful business attraction, it's all about just finding the specific assets that you need to highlight when it comes to your value proposition. Once you have been able to pull those facts out and put together a good value proposition, then you need to start thinking about where you can actually find those industries and companies. Now, the cluster mapping tool that was, again, developed with the Harvard University and their cluster definition, that's always a great starting point. What you see here is a map of the top regions for medical devices. It's still kind of 2015 job numbers and shows you where the job growth has been. And you can also, of course, find the biggest clusters. But it doesn't really give you a sense of the performance besides job growth in the metro areas or counties, and being able to find some more unique niche areas that are also partially driven by companies and not just the aggregate industry statistics. So one way of looking, for example, is if you start out with counties or smaller regions with the highest job growth in a target, it's always helpful to combine that with other information. We're talking here about net job growth, but you don't, for example, know whether that is a place where you would find good targets for lead generation. This might be a small, very small, high growth area that is not quite in the situation where they want to be able to relocate somewhere else. But on the other hand, if you combine that with sales growth, giving you an indication that maybe the labor market is tight or the wage rates are a little bit uncompetitive, as it is, for example, with IT workers in the Bay Area, that gives you an additional angle where you can say, well, if you come to our area, you find the workers, you have more competitive and affordable salaries, and it gives you new target areas that you might have not looked at before. In this case, if you, for example, look at the ones that have had a strong sales growth in, say, the Carolinas or Florida, they would have not popped up if you would have just looked at job growth. So being able to go through these exercises of the target industry identification with the help of your stakeholders, prioritizing them based on SWOT analysis, being able to develop your benchmarking and your value proposition, and then go out and find target areas, including international. It's a little bit harder to find international information, but you can certainly look at foreign direct investment trends and see what type of areas and what countries have invested in the US and where they have invested in certain industries. And again, looking at current trends in your wider area and the wider region that you're located in will also give you some ideas about what countries you might be focusing on. Now, the tricky part then is that Steve is going to talk about: how do you actually then go and identify the opportunities and talk to these companies and make a heads or tails out of the whole process? And Steve is going to talk a bit about that now. Steve?
Thanks very much, Nadine. Okay, let me just get my screen back up here. Okay. All right. Thanks, Nadine. That was awesome. And Nadine is available for weddings and bar mitzvahs if anybody is interested. Okay, so I think it would be remiss of me not to spend a couple of minutes on the site selection process and how companies ultimately choose the locations where they're going to expand to or set up, and talk about some of the differences that we've seen over the course of the past 15, 20 years. So when I first started my career as a site selection consultant back in the early 1990s, the slide that we're looking at now represents what that process pretty much looked like, and pretty much when economic development organizations and the administrators of science and technology parks would get involved in the site selection decision-making process. So the star represents the administrators of the park or the economic development professional. So when a company started to think about an expansion, a new facility, immediately the economic development professional got involved in discussion. And again, that comes back to some of the original thoughts that I had at the beginning of the webinar as it related to the availability of data now. So back in the day, when you needed information as it relates to permitting, zoning, the cost of land, energy costs, availability of workforce, cost of workforce, we had to go to the economic development professionals. However, now, because of the availability of data, both online through free public sources, such as the Bureau of Economic Analysis, or more specifically, just on the websites of economic development organizations, site selection professionals and the real estates involved for corporate site selection decision-making no longer really need to go to the administrators and the economic development folks early on in the process, because so much of that comparative data is so widely available. So today, when we consider when an expanding company gets a science or tech park involved or gets an economic development organization involved, it's almost halfway through their site selection decision-making process. In fact, we surveyed a number of site selection professionals just this year, and 90% of those that we surveyed will reach out to an economic development professional when either developing their shortlist, when planning a site visit, or not at all. So what does that mean? It means that a strictly reactive strategy where we're sitting back and waiting for people to find us will not suffice. We need to be aggressive, and we need to make sure that our parks and our jurisdictions make it to a short list, because if they don't, if we're not proactive about it, and if people are only finding us once they've developed their short list, if we've been deselected, we're out of the race before we even get involved in the race. So that's a bit of an observation that we've made as it relates to the importance of understanding those marketing analytics, as well as understanding our value proposition, which Nadine was talking about. And it also speaks to the importance of understanding where the growth clusters are and where we need to target companies that line up with our assets locally. Okay. So what are some of the other site selection keys? So when we talk to site selection consultants and executives, again, responsible for corporate site selection, the three themes that come up the most are speed, risk, and money. So what do we mean when we talk about speed? Well, when we talk about speed, the speed relates to a company spending money and how quickly that company can turn that investment into making money. So how quickly, by locating in your park, can a company turn their investment into profit? When we talk about risk, companies are hugely risk averse. Risk is the darkest word in corporate America. So they want to know, where is the least risk? Risk avoidance with a huge asterisk. That should be next to all of your marketing materials and marketing messaging. How can a company avoid risk by coming to your park? And then money. By investing in your park, by locating in your park, can a corporation spend less money? Will they spend more but make money faster? When we talked about the speed for making money after investment. And again, from a money perspective, where is there less risk? So when we're thinking about our marketing materials and when we're thinking about talking to corporations, these are three themes that I would keep very close in mind when I'm talking to a corporate executive. We always need to remember that corporations are in business typically for one reason and one reason only, and that is to enhance their bottom line. So yes, as Nadine talked about, locating their employees in places that are very favorable from a quality of life perspective is important, because that drives productivity and efficiencies. At the end of the day, it's very important that we're able to position ourselves as a location where companies can be as profitable as possible, as quickly as possible. Okay. So now how do we target companies? Well, there are approximately 6 million companies across about 900 or so 6-digit NAIC codes that typically make up the companies that economic development organizations are looking to attract and science parks are looking to attract. So we're not talking about the numbered companies that own McDonald's franchises or our local corner grocery store. We're really talking about the kinds of companies that are in the service industries that we're most interested in, or in the high-tech companies or manufacturing businesses. So with 5.7 million companies, how possibly can we find the ones that are expanding? Well, there's traditional sources. We can look to companies and try to understand their priorities in terms of employment, in terms of revenue growth, which we just talked about. Can we look for companies as it relates to industries that are growing? Yes, this is very important. From a foreign-based company perspective, the leading indicators for expansion are typically country of origin GDP growth and expansion destination GDP growth. We can look at social web noise. We can talk to multipliers. These are all the kinds of things that certainly we've done over the course of the past 20 years. We've also come to learn that companies tend to prefer to invest in locations where there are favorable trade agreements, where access to market is much easier. One very pragmatic and practical way to find expanding companies is to establish a network of multipliers. So yes, it's very important to most definitely get in front of companies on a one-on-one basis and explain your value proposition. However, how do we find these expanding companies? Well, I like to use the strategy of talking to the one that talks to the many. And where there's an expansion project, there's usually an ecosystem of service providers that are working with these companies at the very earliest stages of expansion. Some of these can include PR firms, corporate law firms, accounting firms, engineering and construction firms, real estate firms, site selection consultants, management consultants, market research firms. So all of these organizations have a role to play when a company is considering expansion. So as you're trying to figure out how to spend your dollars and how to spend your time, which is your most important asset, in trying to uncover which companies are growing, I would strongly suggest that you explore the ecosystem of service providers who are working with these companies that are in expansion mode. So the next great debate, after nature, nurture, size versus growth. Over the course of the past 15 years that we've been in the lead generation business, clients have always come to us and they said, you know, we want Fortune 500 companies, we want Fortune 1000 companies, we want really big, strong, powerful companies with strong brand equity, and you know, they're going to be the catalyst and the drivers of investment and expansion in our jurisdiction. And to a degree, that's right. You know, I can't argue with that entirely. However, I would not completely neglect the notion of growth. So when we explore some of the largest companies across the US, we see actually that these companies are shrinking, both in terms of employment and overall workforce. In 2000, there were a total of 25.5 million Americans employed by public companies. So 10 years later, in 2010, the number had fallen to 20.3 million. That's a loss of 21%. In 2000, the average publicly traded company employed just under 5,000 workers. And by the end of the decade, the average workforce fell by 35% to just over 3,000. And I found this little nugget of information that I put in all my presentations for people to keep in mind just how powerful it is to track growth companies. So almost half of the 1 billion companies in the year 2025 will be new ones. Many will be faster growing gazelles that will generate the bulk of new jobs and value added in the global economy. So McKinsey & Co. is estimating that in 2025, half of the billion-dollar companies don't even exist today. So what's a gazelle growth company and a sustained growth company? A gazelle growth company is a company that has a combined annual growth rate of 20% over a 5-year period, such that they're doubling in size every year. A sustained growth company is one that has 2 important growth periods over a 6-year period. These companies, while not great in numbers, they represent the lion's share in terms of job creation, R&D expense, capital expenditure, buying power. So if you're going to be going out into market and looking for companies to attract back to your jurisdiction, I very much equate sort of the mix of companies that you want to be approaching to an investment portfolio. You want to have some very safe investments, some bonds, some high dividend yielding stocks perhaps, and then you also want to be investing in some small startups. So it's the same idea here in lead generation. Yes, we want to have some of the large, you know, catalyst type companies capable of executing transformational type projects, but we also want, you know, not necessarily smaller companies. Gazelles are not necessarily smaller companies, but they're very fast growth companies. So I always suggest that we keep our eye, you know, towards growth and towards size. So what are some of the signals that we can look towards when we're looking for growth companies? Traditionally, we've always looked at changes in C-level staffing. We've always imagined that if a company changes its CFO or its president, they're heading into a new era of growth or expansion. I don't know that if we were to study this over a period of time, it's true and empirically provable. But certainly, if a new president or a new C-suite executive comes into a company, he or she may have some ideas, some new ideas. So it does bear looking out for. Is the company recruiting in non-traditional markets? This for me is very interesting. If we see a company from overseas all of a sudden is recruiting a general manager, an executive director in the US where they're not known to any previous facilities, this to me would be an important signal that perhaps a multinational or a growth company is sticking its toe for the first time into North America. Has there been employee benefit growth? We do have evidence that shows that companies that have defined contribution, defined benefit, pension plan growth do tend to grow and expand at a greater percentage than companies that don't. We can also look to see if companies have expanded in the near past. There is evidence to suggest that companies that have expanded over the course of the past 5 years are more likely to expand moving forward than companies who have not. Job posting intensity, website translations, if we're looking for foreign-based companies, if all of a sudden their website has an English version, well, this would suggest to us that they're probably looking to recruit people in English-speaking parts of the world or sell into English-speaking parts of the world. This would indicate to us that they're likely looking to enter into a marketplace that is speaking the language that the website's been translated to. Has there been a spike in social web activity? Are there a spike in patent applications? Has the company recently gone through an acquisition, made an acquisition, been merged? Is there a joint venture? Of course, we want to look out for cluster hotspots. And as Nadine alluded to a bit earlier, VC funding is also an important signal for us to look out for. While it's not a huge signal, I think one of the statistics I read not too long ago was something along the lines of about 15% of expansion companies from an FDI perspective, a greenfield investment perspective, are VC funded. It's still a pretty interesting chunk of those companies. So that concludes, Carol, the webinar portion, I guess the slide portion of the webinar. We do have about 10 minutes that we've left for Q&A. So if anybody has any questions that they've jotted down in the chat function, Nadine and I would be very happy to address them.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Nadine. That was a ton of information to kick off this topic. Now, just to let everybody know, this is this is the first webinar of a series of 4 or 5 that we've planned with ROI. So, watch for more alerts on upcoming webinars. I did receive a couple of questions. Now, Steve or Nadine, did you receive direct questions as well?
Let me check. No.
I just wanted to know if you wanted to handle those first, if people were sending them to you directly. The slides are going to be available. We're going to post them online for anybody who wasn't there in the first couple of minutes. So just to recap, ROI has graciously allowed us to post the webinar and the slide deck so that we can go through this later in detail and people didn't have to take copious notes. Mind you, I did make a bunch of notes. I have to tell you the part about how can a company, in my marketing efforts, how can a company avoid risk by coming to your park? I've never thought of it in those terms. So that was one of the little nuggets that I took away. A couple of questions that I had that came in. How do you think about supply chain for digital and software companies?
Steve, you want to start? Me? I can start.
I was waiting for you, and you were waiting for me. Nadine, do you want to take that one up?
We can follow that one up directly afterwards.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
Yeah, I just
ladies first. I was just trying to be a gentleman. But well, Nadine, why don't you go ahead, and I'll chime in afterwards.
Yeah, so it's true that typically when you think of supply chain, people equate it with manufacturing companies. Mm-hmm. So it is a little bit trickier to think of it in terms of service companies, whether digital service or any business service companies. I do think on the supply chain side, there are at a different level. The input is really mostly the workforce. So for me, it's both the when I think in terms of what their needs are, is both other business services I would see as a supply chain input, as well as the workforce itself, really most importantly, but also university assets. So I think they're certainly, those service tech companies are certainly the ones where on the supply chain, on the input side, R&D centers and universities, I would consider as an essential part of the input of the supply chain. On the output side, just to say, on the other hand of the supply chain, that's almost unlimited these days. Certainly, if you're in an area that's already very high tech oriented, you're talking about fintech for legal services and finance services. You're talking about digital and software information for automation for manufacturing companies. It couldn't really be applied to everything. So I think in terms of their plugging in their supply chain is probably less, the supply chain gaps are probably less of a focus with those kind of companies in terms of identifying additional targets. Might be more about the type of companies. Maybe they have very specific type of other companies they want to work with, and it might be more about the collaboration and a cluster effect. So that would certainly, I think for me, would be a case of talking to those companies in your area and see what their needs are.
Yeah, from my perspective, and thanks very much, Nadine, I agree entirely, as I always do with Dr. Jeserich. But when I think about supply chain and questions around supply chain, I'm always very interested in speed of response. And when companies are taking a look at our science park, our research park, our jurisdiction in general, when they ask a question about supply chain, it's very important that we're able to come back to them very quickly with an answer. So whether it's the input or the output, getting the input-output data is not particularly difficult. There's several sources for that data, but for my 2 cents, I'd want to understand sort of the use case. I want to understand why the company is asking that question. When we talk about risk, speed, and money, is the company interested in the addressable market? So on the output side, do they want to know how many clients that they might be able to serve that are within a 1 day's drive, within a certain proximity to Nadine's perspective and workforce, which I guess is a bit outside of your more traditional supply chain analysis, how far is their addressable market from a workforce perspective? And from an input perspective, while digital and software, they don't have a whole lot of hard materials that they would need as an input. However, every company wants to know where their primary inputs are in relation to where they may be setting up shop. So who are the companies and how far are they from where they're going to source materials and services from that they're dependent upon to operate as a company? And then what does the addressable market look like within a reasonable distance of your location? So from my perspective, it's more an issue of knowing where to find that data and having it on hand when a company asks for it, as much as it is to know what the data is itself.
Great. I hope that answered the question. We have another question that came in. What is considered safe for risk tolerances when companies are site selecting? So what is considered safe for risk tolerances when companies are site selecting?
It's an interesting question, and every company would have a different level of risk tolerance. So obviously, if we're looking at a company that's involved at the early stages of an R&D program, the risk tolerance is going to be more flexible. For companies that are coming in more of a manufacturing environment with a post-commercialization product, the risk tolerance is going to be probably a little bit lower. If there's a large component of capital expenditure upfront, then I would suggest to you that the tolerance for risk is going to be very light, particularly when there's significant amounts of debt involved. So I would think that it probably is very dependent on the kind of industry that we're looking at, and it's probably also very dependent on the company and the company culture as well. So sorry, not to be more specific. It's a bit of a tough question to answer, really. Every company has a different level of risk mitigation and tolerance. But I would suggest to you that probably depending on what phase or cycle of development the company is at, and also, I mean, let's face it, the financial health of the company would also be of tremendous importance. You know, what are the debt to cash ratios, and even for a VC funded company, how long is their runway before they're out of cash? So cash on hand would be exceptionally important. So obviously a startup, a high burn rate, high run rate of capital and cash intensive businesses would obviously have a very low tolerance to risk as it relates to that, you know, turning risk into cash as quickly as possible.
Great, thank you for that. Another question that we had come in was, how do I find out about my competitors?
I think I take this one, or do you want to?
Sure. No, Nadine, you are the data guru.
Well, from a data perspective, so to say. Well, I mean, you know, you first probably think, you know, well, you have AURP membership, and you certainly can look at your members, and to the extent that AURP will provide, you know, contact information, background, you can certainly search that way. I guess the first question is how you find peer regions. So how you know, what does it mean to be a competitor? You're not just looking in a region. I might be looking, if I'm comparing counties or cities, I might just say, okay, who has a similar industry mix, who is of the same size, and you know, keep it at that. Again, university research parks and innovation districts are much more particular. So if you're somebody geared towards startups and spin-offs, and you know, have accelerators and incubators, and want to focus on that aspect of innovation, try to find innovation parks that have a similar focus. I think it's also always important to find something. So the size of the economy, in the sense that where you're geographically located, I think always makes a big difference, if only because of the workforce pool available. So are you talking about a university park that's an element of a huge metropolitan area, or are we talking about something a little bit more off the road, a little bit further away from large labor pools and large infrastructure? I think between those two, and again, if depending on your angle, if you have a very specific research, if you, for example, a research park that's focused on anything to do with oncology and cancer, that you probably, anybody in the research park, if you would call them up that specialized, would already be able to tell you immediately would they consider top research parks internationally. And you certainly do want to be able to compare yourselves internationally as well. So again, talking to your current tenants will give you a lot of insights what they consider their peers, even if only in terms of research.
Great, thank you. We are bang on 3 o'clock right now, so I'm going to take this opportunity to thank Stephen and Nadine for the time that they've spent here. Everyone will get a follow-up email with the link to the webinar, so you can walk through it again, or just go through the deck. And we'll all do a virtual round of applause for both of you, and the time that you spent, all the information that you've also shared with us today, and your expertise. Really appreciate it. Love that you are a knowledge partner of AURP, and look forward to setting up our next one. Thanks, you.
Carol. It was a ton of fun, and we look forward to the next one as well. Thanks, everybody, for joining, and thanks a lot, Nadine.
Great,
thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, bye-bye, everybody.
Great, thank you.